Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Sofia Herrera, and I'm a sophomore studying political science and Spanish and getting a minor in Chicano and Latinx studies. This is my second year as a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement at the Dole, including volunteering at programs such as this and networking with our special guests. Through the Dole and its forums, I've had the opportunity to apply my knowledge and learnings to my current internship for Jackson County legislator Manuel Abarca IV. It is also with these opportunities that I've had the honor of receiving and being the current recipient of the Robert J. Dole Service to Country Award, which I was awarded this past spring. Thank you. If you're a student here at KU and would like to join the Student Advisory Board, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system or at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, you will have some time to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able to and just ask one brief question. If you are a part of our virtual audience, you may also submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. And may I introduce our wonderful director, Dr. Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Sophia, for that warm introduction. Good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. We're so glad you're joining us as we welcome Dole Institute visiting fellow Jerry Seib and former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel for their conversation on our presidential candidates, Vice President Harris and President Trump, and how each of their administrations might assert American leadership abroad should they be elected in November. I want to recognize a few special guests in the audience this evening before we get started, who are accompanied by Director of Graduate Military Programs, Mike Denning. We have Dr. Vlasta Zekulik, Ms. Louisa Freutel, Lieutenant Colonel Virginie Lottie, and Lieutenant General David Julazadeh of NATO. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Kansas. Thank you for visiting KU. Before I turn this over to Jerry for our conversation, I'll invite you to several upcoming events this month. Next Wednesday, October 9th at 4 p.m., we will welcome Dole Fellow and lead political reporter for the Kansas City Star, John Shorman, who will host the next installment of his discussion group series, Beyond the Ballot, Understanding the 2024 Elections, where he'll be discussing ticket-splitting voters. Please join us for that conversation next Wednesday at 4 o'clock. Next Thursday, October 10th at 7 p.m., join us for the conversation China in the Heartland, Building a Balanced Approach, which is presented in partnership with the KU Department of Political Science and their partners, the United States Heartland China Association. 2 weeks from today, we'll welcome Jerry back for another conversation, October 17th at 7 p.m. Jerry's guest will be Washington Post Associate Editor Karen Tumulty. Jerry and Karen will discuss the growing divide, political realignment in the modern era. So we look forward to seeing you several times over the next few weeks. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Jerry Seib, our moderator for this evening. As I mentioned, Dole Institute visiting fellow, formerly Washington executive editor of the Wall Street Journal, and our guest this evening, U.S. Secretary of Defense to President Obama and U.S. Senator from Nebraska, Chuck Hagel. Gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to our NATO guests for being here. Thank you to Audrey for handling the names so I don't have to. I appreciate that. Although my wife's name is Roshevich, so I could handle East European names to a certain extent. So, Chuck, thank you for being here.
Jerry,
The University of Kansas does not get to welcome guests from Nebraska nearly as frequently since Nebraska pulled out of the Big 12 and went to the Big 10. And not that we're still bitter about it or anything, but I'm just saying. So.
Well, I'm humbled, Jerry. Yeah.
We're going to talk tonight about America's role in the world, and particularly as it is, and in some cases isn't, a campaign issue this year, and what the consequences of that conversation are and ought to be. And at the end, we do want to get to audience questions, so think of the things you want to ask Secretary Hagel beyond what I have. But Chuck, let's start with the reality here, which is that this is a pretty tough time in the world right now. This is a dangerous moment. I mean, Russian troops occupy a quarter to a third of Ukraine. Ukraine is firing missiles into Russian territory. Israel is having battle on 3 fronts with Hamas, Hezbollah, and on the Palestinians in the West Bank. Iran just fired in the last week the biggest barrage of ballistic missiles into Israel in history. North Korea is building its nuclear arsenal. And China is the ascendant power that is building a military faster than we can. Yet none of this is discussed very much in the campaign. Why do you think that is, and what are the consequences of not having a conversation about this moment in international history?
Well, first of all, Jerry, thank you for having me. There's no one in the news business that I have over the years respected more than Jerry Seib, not just because he's a Kansan, but he's actually got some talent. So, but thank you, and thank you for the Dole Institute's invitation and the University of Kansas. I really do appreciate being here. Jerry, and I think everyone sitting here understands this, that this is the most dangerous time in the world since World War II. And I think that's defined, as you have noted, in what's going on, but even more than that is going on in the world that we don't appreciate, because what we see on top here, which you have noted, there are consequences that trickle down to every society and every global citizen. And the reality is this is an interconnected world. There's no such thing as, well, let's just keep America out of it, or we'll let other countries deal with their problems. That world doesn't exist anymore. Actually, it hasn't, and we should have taken some lessons from the 1930s. And I think we're unfortunately relearning some of those lessons that produced a chaotic world for 5 years, an uncertain world in World War II. That said, to your question as to why isn't this global reality and challenge and consequences more noted and more discussed and more framed in the presidential campaign? Well, I think maybe 2 or 3 reasons. One, I think most Americans look at where America has been, certainly over the last 20 years, with 2 wars that have ended badly. In my opinion, one war we should have never gotten into. But the reality is...
You're talking about Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, Iraq. But we should have learned something from Vietnam. And I served in Vietnam with my brother all of 1968, the worst year of Vietnam. We sent 16,000 dead Americans home in 1 year. We should have learned some lessons from that, and we didn't. The longer you get into a war, no matter how noble, as liberators, the longer you stay, you become occupiers. And that's exactly what happened to us in Iraq, Vietnam, Afghanistan. And we become hated. And so I think the American people have said, we're sick of this. We don't want any more of this. Let the world sort it out. Let the Middle East figure it out themselves. Let Ukraine figure it out. Now, we'll support them through NATO and where we can. But, you know, we've got our own issues. We've got our economy, and we've got inflation, and you know all the issues. That's number one. Number two, I think the United States has become a very dangerously insular country. I don't think our education system, our public education system, helps that. In most schools around the country, we really don't teach history. We don't teach geography. We don't teach about the world. We're so technical, artificial intelligence, and we're so focused on getting a degree in some kind of technology that we've lost sight of these bigger global issues that affect us all, that affect technology, affect every component of technology, every component of lifestyles. And as I said earlier, it's an interconnected world. So whether it's trade or relationship or any dimension of the economic world or our economic system, why do we have inflation? Why do we have higher energy prices? Pandemics. I mean, we just went through one of the worst we've seen in the world in a long time, COVID. I suspect that will not be the last. We were unprepared for that. That had tremendous effects on our economy, COVID. And so rather than back that up a little bit, well, why have we had issues over the last 2 and 3 years with inflation and problems with getting products, cost of products and so on? Well, that's partly a supply chain issue. That was a result of COVID and so on. So I think those issues, at least in my mind, Jerry, are at least some of the paramount reasons, and then the variations of what I've just said, I think too. But if I had to put my finger on one thing, it's we've become very insular, and our leaders, I think, in many ways have failed us, and they've not taken the initiative to explain what Bob Dole used to explain, what many I served with in the Senate explained about the kind of world that we're in. It's a world with great opportunities. I mean, the world wouldn't be as near as good as it is without the United States leadership over the years.
So, as you're suggesting here, there's some isolationist tendencies in both parties. You know, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs did a survey just a few weeks ago and found that fewer than 6 in 10 Americans think the U.S. should take an active role in world affairs, the lowest number they've ever found. But it's particularly true in your party, the Republican Party. Back in 2004, when you were still in the Senate before you became Defense Secretary, you wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs magazine. And I actually think if you look in your program, you can find this Chuck Hagel piece through a QR code on your program. And you talked about what you thought Republican policy, foreign policy going forward ought to be about. And you said Republicans should stand for supporting alliances, expanding free trade, backing the diplomatic corps, promoting democratic reform in the Middle East, deepening relations with China, and strengthening energy security. With the exception of energy security, your party's basically backed away from every one of those positions. What happened to the Republican Party?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure we have a few weeks to actually explain that. I think two things. One, I think the leaders of my party, and I'm not sure there is a Republican Party anymore. I think it's an amalgamation of tribes. That what I said in that article that I wrote in 2004, you're right, doesn't at all come near where the Republican Party is. The party of Bob Dole and Ronald Reagan and all the Republican, John McCain, you know, you go back, the presidents we've had, all of them, it has changed because I don't think we've had the leaders to explain these things, to realize these things, recognizing these things. Two, I think if you go back, and I noted this with some of the the students we met with, to the last 30 years in the Republican Party, starting with Newt Gingrich's contract with America. These were very insular issues that the Republican Party focused on. When I first ran for the Senate, first job, elected political job I ever had, I was told that I couldn't get elected unless I signed every one of these contract with America contracts. You sign you will not raise taxes no matter what. I mean, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I said, well, the job of a representative in Washington that you send to Washington to represent you, a congressman or a senator, that job is about judgment. I mean, you use your best judgment because you don't know what the world looks like in a year or 2 years or 3 years. So we've not taken that approach, I don't think, to governing. And so we've taken narrower and narrower approaches to government and to the responsibilities of government, rather than a more expansive view of how all this connects. And when the contract with America led to the Tea Party, and then we've got the MAGA Party, and I don't want to get into a debate about all that, but those are just facts, what I've just said. That has affected very much the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. The Republican Party used to be a pretty expansive party in its thinking, strong on foreign policy, strong on free trade. Mm-hmm. I mean, those were two essentials, strong on building alliances, mm-hmm. supporting NATO. Just those three examples aren't the case anymore. Yeah. Yeah. And unless we turn that around, yeah. we're gonna put this country in a very, very difficult spot.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I interviewed Mike Pompeo, Kansan, a few months ago, and he was making the same point you were. He was Donald Trump's Secretary of State, and he said one of the problems with the lack of American support for an activist international role for this country is that leaders have not been making the case, explaining why it's beneficial to Americans for the U.S. to be actively involved. Mm-hmm. So what's the case that you would make if you were trying to convince an American who said, well, free trade decimated the manufacturing sector in this country, and we've wasted billions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan? What's the argument that you would make to explain to that person why it's to their benefit for the U.S. to be engaged internationally?
Well, first of all, the world looks to the United States for leadership. It depends on the United States for leadership. Now, you can debate whether that's right or wrong, but that's a reality. I mean, we get kicked around, I know that, by different countries or for different reasons. But if you wouldn't have had, over the years, a steady, strong, clear-thinking American leadership for the world, things would have gotten off track a hell of a lot sooner than where we are today, in a very perilous way. That's just a reality. Now, we took that on after World War II. We were the only economy standing after World War II. There was no other economy in the world. We, along bringing our allies with us, we defined the world order after World War II. Imperfect, problems, issues, but you think about the results of what we built. They're pretty good. Mm-hmm. More people free, more people with opportunities. I mean, you go down the line. Yep, problems. But just because we were successful during those years doesn't mean that new issues and problems are not going to pop up. Dictators like Putin and Xi and Iran and North Korea. So constant leadership that America has to provide in the world, in my opinion, is non-negotiable. I mean, that's just a reality. And why is that important to America? Because it affects everything that we have in this country. And again, I was talking about our economy, our trade benefiting us. I mean, our GDP, I mean, with all the issues that we have and the problems, I mean, America still is the strongest country in the world with the strongest economy in the world, GDP. Yes, we've got issues, but to blame the problems that we've got on immigrants is just complete fabrication and nonsense. Immigrants have been one of the strengths of this country. Who in this room is not doesn't come from immigrants? I don't think a person. That's just one example, and this is clearly in the interest of America, because if you don't provide that leadership, and if you don't continue to strongly support NATO, for example, the most successful collective security pact in the history of mankind, and talking about the outgoing Japanese Prime Minister, Kishida, who just left office this last week, he's suggesting that they build a Pacific Asian type NATO collective security. Well, why did he suggest that? Because it's not been successful? No, just the opposite. With more and more threats coming to the Pacific area and to Asia, and if we don't stay ahead of this game, we will find ourselves exactly where we found ourselves in 1941. Only the time frame will be different because of the weapons today. So we've got to, and it goes back to my point about education. We've got to help educate the people of this country as to how did World War II come about. I mean, we were an isolationist country in the 1930s. Let Europe decide that it's not their, Hitler's not going to bother us. Nobody's going to bother us. And then we cut off oil and other natural resources to Japan, thinking, well, that's just the way Japan's going to have to live with it. And they attacked Pearl Harbor. There are consequences for every action in the world and everything that we do, and there are consequences for non-action.
Yeah. So let's take this to the current campaign as we sit here, about a month out from Election Day. You were one of more than 100 former national security officials who are Republicans who signed a letter a few weeks ago endorsing Kamala Harris for president. Why did you sign that letter? Why is that where you've come down, and why not Donald Trump?
Well, first of all, I've watched Donald Trump, as we all have, for 8 years. 4 years as president, in the last 4 years. I've always believed that the indispensable requisites of leadership, but indispensable requisites for life, are three things. Character, that's the most important. Character is about honesty, it's about integrity. And if any institution has a leader without that, it's going to end badly. The next indispensable requisite is courage. Courage to do the right thing no matter what. And third, judgment. We all make mistakes. But when you elect anybody for anything, it's judgment. And I don't care how many degrees you have or how smart you are. It's judgment. And if you don't have those three in your leaders, you're going to have a problem. So that's where I started with Trump. I don't see those three requisites of leadership in him. I see just the opposite. But more specific, what he said and what he did as president on NATO. Why do we need NATO? If they don't pay up, we'll pull out of NATO. We don't need it. What he said recently about Ukraine and Putin, let Putin do, his words, what the hell he wants to do. Ask the question in a debate about Ukraine, is it important Ukraine wins? He wouldn't answer the question. Does anybody really realize what Putin has done here? He has done something that no aggressor has done since the end of World War II. Invade another independent European nation. If you let somebody continue to do that, it just, well, that's Ukraine's problem. That's not going to be the end of it. His foreign policy, raising tariffs, 10% tariffs, 20% tariffs across the board on everything we import, including our allies and our friends, aside from the economic consequences of that, which are disaster, every economist tells you that, but the foreign policy consequences of that with our partners and our own economic consequences of that, a disaster. So I looked at all those and more issues. I don't agree with Harris on everything, but I think elections are always about choices. It's not about who I wish. I wish this person was running. No, your election choice here, you're either going to have Harris as the next president or you're going to have Trump. I mean, you can waste your vote and go with a nut like Kennedy or somebody else, but or just not vote if that's what you prefer. But one of those two are going to be president. And as I judge it all, and I've just explained a lot of it, it's pretty clear to me that I'll go with Harris.
Yeah. She's got her own problems. I mean, she, in terms of American engagement in the world, she's got a progressive left wing that is got its own isolationist tendencies, and that in particular is at least skeptical, if not more, about helping Israel defend itself. Has she done enough to address her own progressive left on these issues? I mean, she said what Joe Biden said about Ukraine and helping Israel, but is she saying that directly enough to those in her own party who don't buy it?
Well, no, I don't think she is. I mean, she's made it pretty clear where she is, like you said, on those issues. She's answered the questions. But I mean, I get it too, because she's factoring in order to get elected. But I don't think that's good enough. I think you've got to be more direct and more honest than that. And I don't think the progressives in the Democratic Party are not going to vote for her because she says, no, I'm going to strongly support NATO in Ukraine and in the Middle East, and we got to stay involved in anything. I don't think they're going to leave her and certainly vote for Trump. But I can understand maybe why she's doing it. I don't think she is doing enough. I think she needs to do more. I hope she does more. I've talked to her people about this, but I think they are governed by what you started out with saying, the poll numbers on this, where Americans, I mean, every poll shows what are your top concerns and issues for you. Foreign policy is not one of them.
Yeah.
And so I think she's addressing probably where the issues are according to the polling people. But I don't think you got to do more than that if you want to be president, especially because nobody really knows her.
Yeah.
She's been a vice president, a senator for a few years, not many years, and they don't know enough about her on these things.
So let's talk a little bit about what happens after the election. And obviously nobody here and nobody on God's green earth knows what's going to happen in this election. Anybody who tells you they do is lying. But somebody will win, somebody will lose. And then one of the things that you used to look for at a time like that, once the election was over and you moved forward, was bipartisanship in foreign policy. You know, it used to be said in Washington when you and I were much younger there, that foreign policy debates end at the water's edge, that you have agreement, you have bipartisanship, you have consensus on important foreign policy matters. Is that still possible today? And I ask this because you were a Republican senator who became the defense secretary for a Democratic president, Barack Obama. That's bipartisanship. Mm-hmm. Can we expect that after the election? Is it even possible in the current environment?
Well, I hope we get back to it. I'm always hopeful, but I'm a realist too. And you know, you look at this country, and how have we done with all the mistakes we've made so well over 250 years? And we didn't get it all right at the beginning. That's why we have 27 amendments to the Constitution. But we have a Constitution. We're a nation of laws. We can change things. We do change things. We can recognize when we're not doing things right. And on your question on foreign policy, to get back to a more bipartisan, I think we can. What we need is leadership. We need leadership to show that. I think Biden has tried to do that. I think he's done some of that. He comes from that school. That's where he's come from, and that's who he is. I mean, I've worked with Biden for 25 years on these issues, and I think he, from where Trump was to Biden after 4 years, I think he's made some progress. We're not near where we need to be because it's got to be the Congress, it's got to be the American people too. And because if foreign policy is not a Republican issue, it's not a Democratic issue, it's an American issue. And as I often reminded my colleagues on the floor of the Senate, and I've mentioned this, when I would say, you know, we all took an oath of office when we got here. The oath of office was to the Constitution, was to the people of our country. It was to our country. It wasn't to a president. It wasn't to a partisan policy. It wasn't to a political party. It was to what we thought was right for the country. Clearly, foreign policy is. Now, you can have issues, and that's okay. That's debate, and that's a democracy. But democracies can only work when there's compromise and when you come back together. And I don't know of an issue where we've worked better together in a bipartisan way over the years, certainly since World War II, where we've been able to do it on a foreign policy basis. And we're going to have to come back to that. But if you don't have the leaders to bring you back, and then to explain to the American people why is this important, you can still have debates, that's okay. But you respect each other. You respect each other's opinions. And in the end, it's always got to be about what's best for the country.
And do you think that there will be enough bipartisan support in Congress and in the White House after the election to continue supporting Ukraine at the levels we're supporting Ukraine right now?
First of all, I don't know. But I do know that this is a very defining election. And I've just talked about why I'm supporting Harris. This election is going to define one hell of a lot. It's going to define the future of foreign policy in this country and domestic policy. It's going to have significant consequences. That's where I start. But you got to have the Congress with you. I mean, a president can only do so much. Article 1 of the Constitution is not about the presidency, it's about the Congress. And the Congress has got to come together as well with the right leadership in Congress on this. And I still think it's possible that we can do this. And again, it goes back to your question. The American people have got to understand it. And that means that your leaders have to make a point of explaining it. And I think we can do it, and I think we have to do it, and I think the consequences of not doing it are going to be so bad that maybe that reality will set in. I don't look for the change in a year or 2 years, but I think if you elect the right people in the next 4 years, you can start to turn this around. Now, Ukraine is going to be the real test here, because everybody's getting a little tired of this. I mean, even people who support Ukraine. I mean, this is going on for 3 years. I mean, how long is this going to go? And the Europeans are going to get tired of it, and we keep putting in more money and more resources. The Middle East keeps heating up. That's not going away soon. A lot of priorities. There's going to be a movement to, well, why can't we get a diplomatic settlement here? And if we've got to give Putin part of Ukraine, well, give him part of, I mean, so this is going to be a real test over the next year, whether we can sustain this or not. I mean, just the reality, I was at the Pentagon last week, I mean, the week before last, and spent an hour with Austin, and I stay in touch with, everybody. But the fact is, the weapons that we've been giving Ukraine, I mean, that's drawing down our inventory too. Yeah. It's drawing down all European NATO members' inventories, what the major European countries are doing through NATO. So this just can't go on indefinitely. So then how do you end it? I mean, how do you end it in a way that's honorable, that's right for the future for Ukraine, but also for the future of the world? Yeah. China is watching this very carefully. The consequences of how this ends are going to be pretty dramatic, because if China sees this ending clearly in Putin's favor, China's been looking at Taiwan, and they've been pushing this issue with Taiwan, as you know, and many here have been watching that more and more, invading airspace, sea space, trying to choke Taiwan off more and more. And if they see a world that's, well, we'll contest it, an invader so far, but an invader can do what they want. We're not going to jeopardize our country or our standing. So that's another consequence of how this ends.
So a couple of other issues I think will face the next president. One is figuring out an international alignment to confront China over the long run. You mentioned that briefly before. And the second one is rebuilding our defense industrial base. Let me ask you about those two in turn. What kind of international alliance needs to be put in place to deal with continuing challenges from China? And I say that mindful that Australia and India, along with the UK, looks to be a particularly important alliance that hasn't really formalized yet. So what's the next president going to have to do in constructing an international framework for confronting China? Well,
I think Biden has made a good start on this, and you mentioned bringing the Quad. They were all here in Delaware, 2 weekends ago. Australia, India. India is very important. Let's start there. When I was secretary, I was the first American official to meet with Modi. Modi had just come into office. I spent 3 days there, and we were the first to sign defense, India-U.S. Defense joint exercises. And those have just gotten more extensive. India is going to stay neutral, stay both sides of it. I mean, I get that. That's their culture. That's who they are. And we don't want to try and pressure that, because that'll just alienate them. But how we're handling them now and bring them into our orbit and to see the benefits of the West versus the benefits of dealing with China, I think it's a smart way to do it. Australia is clearly turning more and more with us, new bases, allowing us to have bases there. So those are important.
And Japan is part of the Quad also.
And Japan is the other part of that. Kishida, the outgoing prime minister, was a very strong supporter of this relationship. The new prime minister, I believe, is right where Kishida is on upgrading their military, putting more resources in their defense system, and that's critical. South Korea, one of the things that Biden has done too in the last 4 years, brought the South Koreans and the Japanese a little closer. We understand history, we understand the bad history, but we got to move on here. Yeah. So that's critical. Those countries are really critical. The UK is very important here too. Trade is all part of that. Yeah. Our economic relationship is part of that. So I think where we're headed, and again, I give Biden a lot of credit for that, it's the right direction. If Harris is elected, I think she continues to grow that. And I think that's the approach to China. One other thing I'd say on China, you saw a national security advisor was just over there in China. Secretary of State Blinken. The way I've described China, I wouldn't say it's an enemy, it's a competitor. Yeah. And I think we're smart in that. I don't think we want to push this concept, well, China's our enemy. Yeah, we know what China's doing, they're stealing from us and so on, but we've got to be careful here. Let's be smarter about that. Let's cooperate where we can cooperate with them. Let's be very realistic and clear-eyed what they're pulling and what they're trying to do and what they will continue to do. But they're on a losing course, Jerry. Playing footsie with Putin, that's a disaster. They know it. Putin's economy is a basket case, and it's going to continue to be a basket case. They're scared to death of the crazy kid in North Korea. I mean, you want this to be one of your best allies? I mean, China's got some big internal problems too. So let's be smart in how we deal with China. And you deal with China as much as anything through strong alliances, through strong allies, through strong partnerships, not just in statecraft, in foreign policy, national security, military, but in economic policy.
And if Donald Trump wins, do you think he would continue to lean on and build out the Quad? India, Japan, Australia,
No, I don't, because what he said, what is the red cap he wears all the time, what's it say? Make America great again. Screw the rest of the world. I mean, he says that. Yeah. I mean that's what he says. Let's get America great again. We can make America great again. Yeah. The rest of the countries are on their own. We'll deal with them when we have to, but that's not our priority. That's not the world we live in anymore. Of course we're going to take care of Americans. Of course we are, and we have to. But you can't do that at the exclusion of all the other relationships you have in the world for the interest of America. Yeah. And no, I think if he's elected, I don't think he'll change any than where he says he is and what we saw in the 4 years that he was president.
There's one final question I want to ask you, and then I do want to turn to you all for questions, so keep in mind what you want to ask. You mentioned trade a couple of times. Is free trade dead? And I ask this not just because Donald Trump wants to impose 10% or 20% tariffs on everything we import, but because even in the Democratic Party, the Biden administration has never rolled back Trump tariffs on China. They seem happy to live with them. Yep. In our system, broadly defined, is free trade still a thing that anybody will defend?
Well, I hope so. But that's going to be a challenge going forward because of all that we know in the world. It's going to be an issue, and it will continue to be an issue. But if you cut that off, let's go back to NAFTA. Has America benefited from NAFTA? Oh my God, yes. I mean, in every measurement you take, we have benefited greatly. Do we have problems with Mexico for obvious reasons? Yes, yes, yes. Canada is Canada. But what we did there in NAFTA to open up the free trade zones and to take tariffs off a lot of things, almost everything. We're not going to be able to do that with every country, of course, but we should learn a lesson from that in how it benefits. Now it takes both sides too to make that happen. But I think that has got to be a very significant part of a policy, of an economic policy of a president. And a president has to lead on that issue, or the Congress won't come with him, or her, because the Congress is going to be always susceptible to the immediacy of politics. And I get that. I was a politician. When you go home and you have meetings with constituents, and they'll tell you, well, we're getting screwed by this person, or can't get our corn over there, or whatever. But I look at Nebraska. I mean, since really the 50s, and then when we really got into free trade, how that's transformed the state of Nebraska in selling our corn and our soybeans and other products. Same thing Kansas, same thing any Midwestern states, same thing for Minnesota. I mean, to open up markets around the world, it's helped every community in the world, in the country too, mainly our country, to get these export markets. Now, it's imperfect, I get that. People cheat, I get that. But you can't give up on the bigger concept and recognize the good that it does. Plus, it brings people together. It's like education. It's like so much of progress that we've made in our country with exchange programs, student exchange programs, all the things that bring people together. You're always going to have nuts on the left and the right and say, no, we can't do this, or this is screwing up my community. I get that. But, that's the challenge of leadership.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so I open it up to you all. If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll try to find you. We'll start way back there, and then I'll work my way front. Wait till somebody comes with a microphone. If you could stand up, it'll be easier for us to hear you. And I just remind you, a question actually is a statement that ends with a question mark at the end. Oh, it's Will. Hey, Will, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Respectful of the format, I have a direct question, but I want to provide just a little bit of context after that. So,
This is one of my former students.
Oh, is he?
Yeah,
He didn't learn a damn thing then.
Obviously not. The direct question, have recent secretaries of defense been too technocratic? And the context of that question, if you look over the last 30 to 40 years, there's basically two types of Secretary of Defense. There are the very bureaucratic political infighters. You think of like Frank Carlucci, Robert Gates, Ash Carter. And then there's sort of the consummate politicians, former Senator Chuck Hagel, Dick Cheney, Leon Panetta. And over the last 8 years, we've had exclusively military men, often using somewhat apolitical language. As we've heard a lot about political leadership in foreign policy recently. Is a more traditional politician better as Secretary of Defense than the technocratic generals we've had? I guess, anyway, yes, the military men we've had over the last 8 years.
You were just talking about this.
We were just talking about this at lunch. Let me say before I give you an answer, the military leaders that we've had as Secretary of Defense, I've known them both, Mattis and Austin, very well, and all worked with me. Have the greatest regard for them, respect for them, tremendous people. That said, I have never believed that you should make a career military man Secretary of Defense. First of all, I think the separation there is important. But military leaders, and I have the highest regard for military leaders, and our country's been so well served by their selflessness. But the Secretary of Defense job is a different kind of job. It's a political job. And you better know something about defense. You better know something about foreign policy and why you're there. I mean, I don't think you can put any politician or at the Pentagon But I think you put the generals in a tough spot when you make them Secretary of Defense, because the way they're trained and their whole backgrounds, what we were talking about, is vertical. And political experienced people, leaders, you're developed differently. You're developed with peripheral vision. You've got to have peripheral vision. Somebody asked me, well, Mr. Secretary, how was it to run the largest institution in the world? And I kind of laughed and I said, well, I didn't run the largest institution in the world. I was Secretary of Defense. But I said, let me tell you, a Secretary of Defense deals with many empires within his own empire and outside. You deal with the White House. You deal with the Congress. You deal with the press. You deal with your internal civilian career employees who you better listen to. You deal with each empire. Each service is an empire unto itself. The Army, the Navy, I mean, all of them, Marines. You're dealing with all those power groups that influence every decision that's made. Yeah, you're Secretary of Defense. You have to make the final decision. But you're not doing that alone. You're not running this big empire alone. I mean, you're running this with the chiefs of staff of each of the military branches, with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, with the senior appointees, the undersecretaries, the assistant secretaries. You better be listening to all of them. And then hopefully you come up with the right decisions. And the White House always weighs in. Sometimes that's for good and sometimes that's not. Speaking as a former Secretary of Defense. So, yeah, I don't think a general or an admiral should be Secretary of Defense. I've said that. Lloyd Austin knows that, and Mattis knows that. I've said that for some of the reasons I've just mentioned. Not because they're not great leaders, but you need more than just that military understanding to lead the Defense Department.
Right there.
You had a good professor, obviously.
Yeah, right.
Oh, you. Okay. So I want to know if you think that if Trump loses this election, will that change the Republicans in the House and the Senate? Will their views change? I know darn good and well some of the, I suspect that some of their, beliefs, they say he won the election, but I know they don't believe that. Do you think they'll go back on that? Will they change if he's not reelected?
Good question.
Yeah, well, on the first question, will they still say and profess that Trump won the election? No, I think that's a dead issue if Trump loses. I mean, who cares? It's all over. Good, say good night, Donald, and that won't be an issue. But your more important second question, do I see the Republican Party changing because Trump lost? And that means if Trump loses, that means that the Trump Party, which is the Republican Party, it's been the last 8 years, the Trump Party, will have lost the last four election cycle elections. Remember, 2 years ago, the red wave was supposed to bring in a Republican Senate. Well, it didn't, and Mitch McConnell said because we didn't have quality candidates. And I think he was partially right. But anyway, point being, elections are not about losing. Politics is not about losing. Politics is about winning. Trump will be gone. I mean, he may want to still get an interview or two, but if he loses, he loses. I suppose he won't go quietly, but that's his history. That will not necessarily immediately transform the Republican Party. But what it will do, it will implode the current party. The current Republican Party is going to have to change leadership. Trump and the MAGA crowd that's in charge in Nebraska just went through it last summer. The MAGA crowd in Nebraska threw out all the other Republicans who were chairman of the party and all the officers. So you've got real tension in Nebraska. That's just one state example. So there will be a change. There'll be a change in the kind of leadership you see in the Congress if Trump is out and the MAGA crowd is out, and that will have to that will occur pretty quickly because the Congress will be reorganizing. McConnell's he'll be leaving, so you're going to have a new Republican leader. The difference between who will be the new Republican leader in the Senate, whether he'll be the majority leader or the minority leader, will very much be affected by who wins this presidential election. And if Trump wins, then you'll see a Trump committed senator like a Scott from Florida if he wins re-election, versus if Harris wins, Thune from South Dakota or Cornyn from Texas. I mean, this will affect an awful lot in the Republican Party, but I think it's going to take probably a 4-year period for all of that to really play out. But it will change things, no question about it.
Others? Right here, and then we'll go back there again.
So, Mr. Hagel, given your assertions on the need for American leadership and like strong alliances right now, what do you think about the official shift in national defense policy since 2018 toward great power competition with China and Russia?
What do I think about it?
Yeah. Like, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, like I said, they're a significant competitor. I mean, there is competition. There's no question about it. I mean, they're building their nuclear capabilities. They're building their Navy. I mean, they're building up every component of their national security. Plus, over the years, you've seen them develop trade relationships, the Belt and Road program with African nations, with South American nations. So they're everywhere. But they've been doing it not just by building up their military, but building up their trade relationships and other relationships. Now, they lie and they deceive, and but they're doing it. And there's no question they're contesting us in all those areas. And that's why I've said we've got to be smarter than maybe we have been in how we're dealing with it. Again, I give Biden credit for this because I think he's approached it exactly the right way, being realistic of what they're doing. But don't take it a head-on thing in a way you've got to do that. You don't have to do that. They've got a lot of weaknesses, and let's understand those weaknesses, and let's work on working on those weaknesses with them, and make them even more weaker than they are. I mean, that's a competitor, but you get into a race with China where you say they're our enemy. Well, that's not going to end well. That will not end well. They're a dictatorship. I don't think there's any question that Xi is probably the most powerful ruler they've had since Mao. Probably since, I think, even more than Deng. I met Xi. I went to China in 2014 3 times. And I met with him each time over what the Chinese were doing in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, by building up those little rocks and those sand dunes. And they were lying about why they were building islands, and they were doing that for trade Well, the meetings I had with Xi were not happy meetings, because I had to tell him that, in a nice way, that he was lying. We knew he was lying, and we knew exactly where they were going and what they were doing. And that freedom of navigation of oceans is about as basic to freedom in the world as there is, and we're not going to allow any curtailment of those freedoms to occur. We're not going to do it. And we'll do what we have to do to defend that. And I wanted to make that very clear as she and I looked eyeball to eyeball on that. Now, he wasn't happy with that, and, I get it. But that's the kind of way you got to approach it. Just go to him, and you deal with him, and just be honest with him. We know what you're doing, and you're lying to us. But we're not going to allow this to happen, and just understand that. Now, where we can cooperate, we will cooperate. Where we can get together on things, we will, and so on and so on. But I think that's the smart way to handle it.
I've got time for one last question. I don't know where to go here, so I'm going to go way in the back. Sorry.
So I have a question about those 3 requisites for leadership that you mentioned: character, courage, and judgment. If they're ever in conflict with each other, how can you balance them?
Well, that's a very good question.
It's always the last question that gets you, isn't it? True?
Yeah. I don't think it will ever be in conflict if character is the most important. Because if you have character, you have honesty, and you've got decency, you've got everything else that goes with character. That doesn't mean you're stupid. No, you can be very smart and very clever, but still have character. So I don't think that will ever be a conflict, because character will overrule everything. Character affects your judgment. Character affects your courage. If you didn't have the character, then there'd probably be a little question whether you need courage or not, because you don't have it. You don't have the character to do the right thing, but you also need the courage in addition to the character. So I don't think that will ever be in conflict, at least in my mind.
Well, those seem like good words to end on. Thank you very much, Secretary Hagel, for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. And I do hope, I was happy to see a lot of familiar faces. I do hope you all can come back in 2 weeks from tonight when Karen Tumulty and I will talk about the state of the race and the state of the parties. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Jerry, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.